Matter, wode, and weld, the trifecta of historical plant dyes. If you're interested in early historical textiles, like the Middle Ages for instance, you've probably heard of at least one of these plants. Since the dawn of time, humans have probably been drawn to color. There's evidence of red ochre being used to paint cave walls from tens of thousands of years ago. And although we don't have much evidence for dyes being used in Stone Age Europe, there's a plausible chance that at least ochres and tannins may have been used to darken fiber or paint on animal skins. Outside of prehistoric Europe, there's evidence of natural dyes being used thousands of years ago during the Neolithic. But in prehistoric Europe, we don't see material evidence at least until the Iron Age, where, what do you know? Matter, wode, and weld-dyed textiles crop up. Plant dyes being used on textiles in Iron Age Europe, in fact, is so common that dye analysis of pre-Roman Iron Age textiles showed that around 95% of all textiles from this period have traces of plant dyes. I have a personal theory that plant dyes in Europe are even older because these techniques don't just suddenly appear one day in such a widespread manner. Like evolution, the widespread use of specific skills takes time, and typically techniques get mastered and perfected gradually over long durations and with a lot of practice and experimentation. Although the powerhouse trio of matter, wode, and weld, which produce shades of oranges and reds, blues, and yellows respectively, are immensely important in history, and I'd argue even today for those of us like myself who are crazy about natural dyeing right now. Why did I do this? I really don't need more hobbies, but here I am. These were not the only ways to achieve vibrant, beautiful, and bright colors. There's a plethora of other plants and natural materials that have existed since ancient times that made for excellent dye options. And I'm currently on a bit of an exploration to try a bunch of them out. I knew I wanted to experiment with plant dyes that I hadn't worked with before, specifically to produce fabrics that I'd dye for probably a medieval ensemble, which will consist of a coat and a surcoat. I've really been craving a dusty pink and yellow-green, almost chartreuse combo since getting really into constructing medieval clothing last year, and after looking into some options that may have been native to continental Europe, which is where I live, one tree in particular caught my attention: the birch tree. I have my fabric here, which is this lightweight wool, and I wanted to see what would happen when I would work with two different parts of the birch tree, the leaves and the bark. My first step in the process was to soak the bark, as it needed to sit and stew in water for as long as possible. So in my case, I had a few days. This isn't the outer layer of the silver birch, rather the inner layer called the cortex, which is where the majority of the dye molecules are stored. After a few days, the bark actually started to grow mold, but I didn't feel like this was going to be a problem. Some dyes even require fermentation first, like indigo and wode, in order to work as intended, so I wasn't worried about the bark. However, it did smell like compost, so I needed to keep my home very well ventilated because it was really stinky in here, and it was starting to get overwhelming, and I was starting to get a headache. Especially with the steam, it just made it so much worse. I also went ahead and took another batch of undyed wool and took it through a process called mordanting, which is where I added in about 280 grams of alum, which is a mineral salt, and 47 grams of soda ash. My wool was already pre-washed and very wet to begin with, which helps the mordant bind to the fibers even more. And I'll explain about what mordanting is in greater depth later on. During the mordanting process, as I feared, I also confirmed that my gigantic pot was still too small for what I needed, because you want your fabric to be free-floating and be capable of moving around. So I knew I needed to order a bigger pot. 200 euros, and a few days later, this absolutely massive 98-liter pot arrived in the mail. And finally, I knew I could dye to my heart's content. My pot just arrived, and I want to show you how big it is. I'm like, did I buy too big of a pot? I don't know. Just for perspective, this alone is the lid. Oh, there you go. This is the pot. Oh my god, what is this? This is so big. Look how big it is. Well, it'll probably work this time. I felt like I could probably also maybe take a bath in this pot, so I did try to get in it, but it didn't quite fit, so unfortunately I can't do that. I took my now smaller pot, which is still pretty massive, and added in the slightly moldy and fermented birch bark, 500 grams worth, and set it to simmer. I did not want to let it reach a boil, as this could potentially shift the dye brown, and I wanted it to maintain a nice dusty pink color if possible. I'm also taking notes of my whole process in order to make sure that I know what I did in case I feel like repeating this in the future, because nothing is worse than getting a beautiful dye result and having absolutely no idea what you did. Okay, I'm now allowing my birch bark to simmer for a while on the stove. I did lose track of the pot at one point and I had a hard time controlling the temperature, so it ended up boiling for a little while, which I'm hoping won't cause the color to shift brown, but we shall see. Now I'm going to wait for the bark to steep in the hot water for a while, which means that I have quite a bit of downtime to work on other projects and also just to relax a little bit. In my free time, a show I've really been enjoying recently is called Jetlag the Game. In this show, 3 competitors, Sam Denby, Adam Chase, and Ben Doyle, participate in a travel-based competition around the world. I've been watching season 16, which is a hide-and-seek version where the 3 of them have to find each other throughout the United Kingdom, and I think that this is just such a fun show, and I used to actually live in the UK, so it was quite nice to see some of the places that I recognized. The series is on a streaming service called Nebula, which is the sponsor of this video. I'm actually also a creator on Nebula, and we're an independent creator-owned streaming service that offers ad-free, easy access, and early access content, as well as exclusive content such as Nebula First, where everything is released early, Nebula Plus, where bonus content is available, and Nebula Originals, where prestige, high-quality videos made in collaboration with Nebula can be discovered, just like Jetlag the Game. And although all the Jetlag episodes eventually go up here on YouTube, every new season goes up on Nebula for a while first, meaning that you can watch new episodes of the show long before it goes to the public. And the first episode of season 17 just went live a couple of days ago on Nebula. At Nebula, we are a cooperative, and our platform isn't dependent on fickle algorithms that are constantly changing. The creators you follow on Nebula are actually the ones you'll be getting notifications and content updates from. And we're also free from AI slop, so you don't have to worry about accidentally supporting channels that aren't even run by humans. It's kind of scary these days how long it can sometimes take to realize a channel is AI, even if you're quite aware of that being a possibility. All of my content is released over on Nebula first 2 to 3 days early, including this video that you're watching right now. And you also get guest passes as a Nebula subscriber, where you can gift a first-time watcher 1 week free on Nebula. Nebula offers monthly, yearly, and lifetime subscriptions, and by using the link in the description or scanning the QR code here on screen, you can get a lifetime subscription for just $300 or 50% off of a Nebula yearly subscription costing just $30 per annum. Thank you so much to Nebula for sponsoring this video. It's such a massive support to have a platform like theirs supporting me, so that I can actually focus more on making informative content and less on having to appease algorithms. I'm going to go back and check now on my brewing birch bark. Try saying that 10 times fast, and I'm going to go and see how it's doing and see if it's continuing to do something in the water. My birch bark seems to be doing well. I think it needs another couple of hours at least, and then I think I'll put the material and let it sit overnight. But dyeing with tree material is fascinating because trees are extremely widespread and readily available all throughout history. I also have quite a deep affinity for trees, and because they are so large, with careful foraging it can be possible to obtain plenty of dye material from them without deeply impacting the plant or their surrounding environment. Tree barks and the materials that fall from trees, like galls and cones, are readily used in natural dyeing as a source of tannins. Alder cones, oak galls, and walnut hulls are all such examples. But sometimes the bark of a tree can actually produce a vibrant color in and of itself. You would expect that, like many tree barks, birch bark would be full of tannins, which it is. But unlike many tannin sources that will turn your material some shade of yellow or brown or yellowish brown, birch bark is capable of creating a gorgeous dusty pink, as long as the conditions are correct. I'm sure there are other tannin sources that can produce some colors that aren't yellow or brown. I just haven't worked with them yet, which is why the results of birch bark surprised me so much. It also felt like a 2-in-1 shampoo that actually really works, because often to get a color to be very vibrant, you first need to have your material undergo a process called mordanting. This is the process that I did earlier when I soaked my wool fabric in a bath of alum and soda ash. And during the mordanting process, typically some type of mineral salt is utilized, like alum, to then impact the way that the plant dye will bind to the material, because the mordant opens up the fibers of your to-be-dyed material. But in higher concentrations, some tannins can actually act as a mordant, and then you don't need to mordant your material first. That's why with the fabric I'll be using for the birch bark, I didn't pre-mordant it. With protein fibers like wool and silk, mordanting first isn't always needed, but it does brighten up your color, and it can also increase the color fastness of your final product. So I like to mordant first, personally. You can still get pretty vibrant colors on protein fibers by just plant dyeing, but they have a much higher chance of fading faster with washing and wear. And with cellulose fibers like cotton, linen, and rami, it's pretty important to mordant before dyeing to get vibrant colors. In fact, you often want to complete a tannin bath before your mordant bath, because the tannins help the mordant to stick better to the cellulose fibers, and then all of that gets followed up with the plant dyeing process. It is quite the series of steps, and you can see here how I did it when I dyed some linen with weld to produce a vibrant yellow color for my 16th century Irish lena. And I just realized that the cloth I'm wearing on my head right now is made of that same linen that I dyed. So you can see I managed to get a very vibrant and relatively even color by doing this 3-step process. You can also use mordants like iron to shift the color of your finished project. Iron tends to darken and dampen the plant dye, so it can do things like shift yellows into green and pinks into purples. I'm jumping in here in a voiceover to talk about why birch is potentially a prehistoric dye stuff, but isn't necessarily proven with 100% certainty. So this is talking about Finland only, but birch has been mentioned as a dyestuff in Finnish folklore, and in one study I was reading it says, in Finland the traditional yellows and oranges with the good light fastness came from the spring leaves of silver birch, bog rosemary, crowberry, and heather. However, the author then goes on to say that these dyestuffs are absent in all the analyzed fragments, which raises the question whether these yellow-yielding plants were used at all as a mordant dye in Iron Age Finland, or perhaps the dyestuffs have just degraded completely. So that's why it is plausible, because this stuff definitely did exist in the environment, and readily so. It's just that we don't have an actual analyzed data of this being the case. I already have the leaves soaking in hot water, as I want to try and help along the process of the dye compounds within the leaves as much as possible. It's kind of like brewing a cup of tea, where the steeping process helps to extract more of the tea into the water, therefore strengthening the tea. And one very unique thing, though, about plant dyeing that has always perplexed me is that it doesn't actually matter how much water you use for a dye bath. You want enough water to cover your to-be-dyed material, and that can change a lot depending on how dense your material is. This is why when dyeing, we decide on how much plant matter to use with weight of fabric, or WOF. And that's because the fabric is reacting to how much dye particles or molecules are in the water, rather than it actually reacting to the strength of the water itself. So those dye molecules inside of the water from the extracted plants are then binding to the fabric or to the fiber that you're trying to dye, and then that's producing the depth of the color. So it really depends on how much matter you're putting into the water itself, not actually how much water. Before pre-washing my fabric, I will weigh how much it is with a scale, and then I make my calculations on how much plant material to use based off of that calculation. I ideally wanted to make my fabric have a 100% weight of fabric for the birch bark and the leaves, but I don't actually have enough plant material for that, so I'm doing about a 50% weight of fabric, and I'm hoping that the color won't be faint. The thing with plant dyes is just that you never really know how it's going to turn out, so you use all the knowledge that you can to get the result that you want, but every dye lot is a little bit different. If you like to buy yarn, you know this. You know that 2 dye lots are not going to be exactly the same color, even in a commercial practice. And I guess the surprise is also a part of the joy of the process and ultimately the result. I'm going to let my birch bark now steep for another few hours in hot water, and then let the pot cool down. I'll strain off the material, and then I'll add my fabric into the very giant, absolutely massive pot. I'm going to simmer that fabric for about an hour, and then I'll let it sit overnight. My birch leaves have been simmering in this smaller large pot for about 2 hours now, and I think I'm ready to put my fabric in. This is a very nice lightweight wool gauze, And I'm not going to be making a medieval garment out of this actually. This is kind of like a test run so that later on I can do the medieval garment for a future project. But I actually have another project that's more urgent that I want to make this colorful for, and I won't tell you what it is because it is for a very soon upcoming future video, like one that's coming out in the next couple of months. So I'd rather keep it a surprise, but you will see it referenced at some point. I also pre-mordanted this one a couple or maybe a few days ago now. I can't remember when I did it. But that means that the material here would be about 200% weight of fabric, which is what we were wanting, because this is about 250 grams of material. And I put in about 500 grams of birch. So I'm going to give it a go. I'm glad I did this sort of tea bag, painter's bag trick, because it's going to be so easy now to take the material out. And I don't actually need to use the giant pot, which means that since I tend to go to bed pretty late, I can set the giant pot to boil for about an hour or two before bed, and then let it cool overnight, and then I can have both the pots cooling overnight, and then I won't need to worry about actually starting this whole procedure tomorrow. So that's really good news, actually. It's the next day, it's the afternoon, and I'm going to actually check on the fabric finally, which is very exciting because it's been sort of sitting in the hot water all night to just soak up all of that color. And I also went ahead and weighed the fabric in the big pot down with some jars full of water. And that's just to make sure that it dyes as evenly as possible, because that's always a risk with natural dyeing, that something is sticking out of the water too much. So first things first, I'm going to check out the smaller pot. Oh, I can hear things moving around in there. It's funny. So let's check out the hopefully greenish yellow first, and fingers crossed that it's actually greenish yellow and doesn't look some other color. All right, well, here it goes. This is our moment of truth. Let's open up the pot and see what is happening in here. Okay, smells good. It smells like birch tea with honey is the best way I can describe it. It smells weirdly sweet. Ooh, wow, interesting. It's a very orangey yellow, which I was not expecting actually. I'm curious how it's going to look when it's washed out and also when it actually fully dries. But yeah, it's a very vibrant orangey yellow, I would say. I'm not getting chartreuse from this, so I guess there's even more yellow. As you can see, I have a lot of yellow on today. I have this on, I have this, which I dyed with weld, and the colors you can see are quite different. This one is a lot more cool toned, but yeah, this is surprisingly warm. The water is still a little bit warm too. It's amazing how much these pots can hold their heat. 3, 2, 1. Great. I'm going to dump this pot now and then move the large pot results into this one, so that way you can all see what's going on and whether or not we got a nice blush pink color. Again, with natural dye, you just never really know. Here's my gigantic pot. I'm going to now step up my step ladder so I can access it. As you can see, I used jars of water and also a bowl full of water to weigh the fabric down, but let's see what result we get. Ooh, the color is interesting. I've not seen one like this before, actually. I'll show you in just a second. Suspense might be killing you. Wow. Wow, this is so interesting. It's like a very pink-leaning brown. I love this, actually. I think it's so funny, too, that I love natural dyeing so much because I'm actually a professional colorist. And so color is a massive part of my life. I love it in clothes I wear, in the work that I do outside of YouTube. And no surprise here, I'm also just so amazed by natural dyeing now because of my obsession with color, and color science for that matter. Oh, this is such a big pot. And if you're wondering how I'm gonna get the water out of this pot because it's about 40 liters and it's pretty heavy, I'm actually going to remove it one bucket or one bowl full at a time and dump it, and then once it's light enough to pick up, I will then take the whole pot and rinse it. I really like this, and that's only at 50% WOF. Imagine if I had done 100 or 200, it probably would have been even nicer. So these are my results wet. I'm so curious what they'll be like when they're washed and dried. I'm thinking probably similar, but maybe a little bit more subdued. And I don't know, I think they look really nice together. I'm really impressed by the result, actually. I thought this was going to end up being way more brown than it ended up being because last night when I was looking at it, it was not looking very hopeful, but something happened in the night and it changed a little bit. And now it's a lot more pink. That makes me really happy. It is actually in the light kind of a dusty rose that just leans slightly brown, so that's really cool. And I definitely thought this was going to be more green, but that's okay. It's a really nice yellow still, and I like yellow. As you can see, I'm wearing a lot of yellow. I'm going to go and rinse these out in the shower, and then I like to actually throw them in the washing machine to go on one of the wool cycles to just, without soap, kind of just get everything out, all the rest of the dye, and then I will hang them to dry and check in probably very early tomorrow morning. Why is dyeing so exciting? Good morning, it's 7 a.m. and I need to go rush off, but I wanted to show you the results of the dye. It came out really beautiful, actually. I'm really impressed. So this is how the wool turned out, and it's this really beautiful kind of beigey, pinky color, dusty pink. And yeah, I really like how this turned out. In some light, it looks more brown, and in other light, it looks more pink. But right now, I think it's looking pink. At least on my viewfinder, it looks pink. Overall, it turned out pretty even. There's just a few areas where it's a little bit blotchy, and that's because those areas were sort of sticking out of the water a bit at one point. So I think with dyeing, you really have to be quick to get everything under the water as fast as possible. So I can show you the other fabric, which turned out like this. It's a very gorgeous, vivid yellow, and it's super even. The dyeing that I did was really successful, and I don't think there's any blotches on it whatsoever. It's just extremely even. So the two colors together look like this. So this is the bark, and that's the leaves, and this is two parts of the birch tree, which is kind of amazing. And I am birchwood in the middle, so birch bark, birch wood, and birch leaves. Yeah, that was such a stupid joke. The sun is starting to rise. Everything is beautiful today, and I'm going to get going. Thank you so much for watching this experimental video. I might continue this series in the future, we'll see. Let me know if you are interested in seeing even more dyes being explored throughout history, because yeah, it's something I really enjoy doing, so maybe I'll continue the series. See you in the next video. Bye bye!